Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. I'm Liz Goodrich, part of the Community Relations team at Deschutes Public Library. And you are here today for an installment of our Deschutes by the Decade series, which is a series of programs that we started in January 2020 when the library celebrated our 100th birthday. Our presenter today is Kelly Cannon Miller. She is the Executive Director for the Deschutes County Historical Society, which operates the Deschutes Historical Museum in downtown Bend. She is a graduate of Portland State University with an MA in history. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Oregon Encyclopedia and is a member of the Deschutes Cultural Coalition and writes for both the Oregon Encyclopedia and the Oregon Historical Quarterly. She's the daughter of an archaeologist and spent parts of her childhood in the deserts of southeastern Oregon cataloging rock art and in the back rooms of regional universities and museums. Please welcome Kelly Cannon Miller.
Thanks, Liz. Okay, here we are in the 1960s. This has been a really fun series to do with the library and look at each decade that the library's been in existence. And each time I get started, it's always fun to try and pick which things I'm going to share with you all. I don't intend these decade talks to represent every single thing that happened during these time periods. I try and pick what I think will be sometimes urban legends, things that maybe you've heard about, or stories that maybe you should have heard about if you haven't, and then try and tie it into the larger picture of where our little bit of Central Oregon fits into the whole world. And so on that whole world point, I'll start with our population. We're still very, very small in 1960 when the decade gets going. The entire county itself is only 23,100 people. We've grown by a whopping almost 6% since 1950. Bend is a city of 11,936 people. Redmond is coming in at 3,340. Six Sisters has actually shrunk from 1950. And is down to 602 individuals. And again, thinking about the 60s and the items that come to mind when you think about the unrest that was happening and the civil rights movement and all of those pieces that really loom large in our psyche as Americans, those definitely were at play for us here in Deschutes County, even though our population demographic was, very heavily weighted to largely, white Caucasian residents. It did still matter here. The civil rights movement did. And this is an editorial from the Bulletin, April 29th, 1964. These are the kinds of editorials that I read, and I think about, how long ago the distance between 1964 and 2020 and our current news, and think, wow, we haven't made it very far. This is a brief editorial that talks about a boy who had been shot by two white boys, and it's near the bombing of the church that killed 4 African-American girls, and it just ends with, they cannot help but wonder what would have happened if 2 Negro boys had shot down a white youth under similar circumstances. So the questions of civil rights that are still with us today did impact us here in Deschutes County, and we were thinking about it. The Vietnam War was looming on everyone's mind, and Deschutes County residents served just like they have in every conflict. And in the end, 12 members of our county will be killed in Vietnam. And when John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in November of 1963, Deschutes County reflected on 1959 when JFK and Jackie actually attended Lord's Acre fundraiser out at Powell Butte for the church and bought a quilt from Mrs. Yates, who's smiling there in the middle of this picture on a campaign stop. So that moment in time that everyone remembered where they were also able to reflect on when JFK actually came through Deschutes County. But what mattered to residents of Deschutes County during the 1960s? What were the things that were really taking up a lot of emotional energy and space and work for the people who were living here. And one of the things is Central Oregon Community College, or Central Oregon College as it was generally referred to at the time. The college had existed since the late 40s, of course, 1948, but as part of the school district, as part of the Bend Education District. And in 1962, in January, a multiple county effort to create the taxing district and the college district that we know today came up to the ballot. So it was on the ballot in Klamath, Deschutes, Jefferson, and Crook. And it was a really big deal. Central Oregon College was growing by leaps and bounds. It was very much needed, and voters wanted to make sure that their vote counted. And one of the fun things about this vote, it was the one thing people were voting on this election, and people stood in line until midnight to get everyone accounted for. There were long lines at all of the precincts, and here in Bend through till midnight for everyone to get counted. And it was overwhelmingly approved in all of the counties except one. Crook County did not vote to support the expansion of the college, but all of the other counties saw between 70 and 80% approval for the move. And so that was the big grounding moment for the college that we know today. And here's a shot of the college about 1967 in its current location. And that was the other big news of 1962, was that Robert and Joyce Coates granted 140 acres of land on the west side of Aubrey Butte, specifically for the purposes of establishing the campus. And that major 140 acres combined with then some smaller gifts, kind of keeping up with the Joneses, that other folks decided to either sell at a nominal fee or donate another tract of land in addition, ended up giving the college 202 acres to really start the campus with. And construction began in 1963 of the first three buildings, Ochiko, Modoc, and Deschutes. And they were completed in spring of 1964, and at the dedication ceremony, Senator Mark Hatfield attended. And by 1965, Jefferson, Metolius, and the Student Union buildings were constructed. So the 60s gives us, through some generous philanthropy and really strong support of the community, the college that we know and love today. But bad news also chased the community during the 60s. In 1962, a really shocking murder happened in February of that year. A high school senior by the name of Judi Reeder was found dead underneath the footbridge at Drake Park. She had probably been suffered a blow to the head and then drugged to the river and dropped in the water and drowned in combination with the blow to the head. And the disappointing thing about this case is that still to this day, no one knows who did it. It was a cold case that really traumatized the community of, again, only 11,000 people. And the general feeling was that stuff like this didn't happen here in our small town or our small towns of Deschutes County. And that would be a case that would continue to haunt the community to this day. People really would love to know what happened to Judi, who, for all intents and purposes, was a happy and outgoing and popular member of the high school. But what really mattered? Sometimes I joke all the time, and I'm usually only half joking about all of the history of Deschutes County involves one thing, and that's roads. And how do we get better roads? And nobody's ever happy with the roads. I mean, it even starts with how we break off from Crook County in 1916, because gall darn it, we need some tax dollars to be spent on roads over here, and Prineville's getting all the money. And so this is one of my favorite things. This is an editorial from December 12th, 1960. And this sets the tone, really, for the whole decade of, if we want to be what we think we are, which is this really fantastic place for people to come live, work, start a business, have a family, bring tourists in, have sightseeing, all of those things. If we want to be that, we need streets. But the problem is that we don't want to pay for the streets. So we want to have our cake and eat it too, but we don't want to pay for the streets. This editorial is just pointing out to everyone in the community that, look, we have, in the first column, the lousiest streets in Oregon, with the possible exception of Klamath Falls, which is a nice little dig to Klamath Falls. But as you go through, it simply says, if we want to be these things, we have to step up and be willing to put our tax dollars behind that. But my favorite part comes near the end of the second column, where it says, Bend needs paved streets, just as it needs to get the chickens, hogs, goats, and cows out of the city and into the country. We can't expect to be a first-class city, one that attracts new people, if we can't at least act and look like one. So most of the city at this point still has a lot of dirt roads. There's not a lot of pavement in Bend. On the east side, you're going to run into dirt roads that get, through the summertime, get really dusty, and the city is paying money to have water trucks come around periodically throughout the day to water them and keep the dust down. So how does Bend grow up? How does Deschutes County grow up? Well, one of those things was in 1962, after a lot of work and a lot of talk, with almost no fanfare at all. This is what you see on the screen is the entirety of what shows up in the newspaper. But in 1962, we open up the US Highway 97 bypass. So prior to 1962, Highway 97 actually ran along Wall Street and came right through downtown. And in 1962, they made the decision to move it to 3rd Street, which was a residential area. And people worried downtown, justably so, of what would the effect be. And the Bulletin greeted it with much optimism. Robert Sawyer, who was the editor of the paper at the time, was all in favor of moving the highway to 3rd Street. And he editorialized, what will the effect on downtown Bend be? This is the big question. It is a question that has caused considerable worry on the part of long-established businesses. The educated guess is that this worry is without foundation. It will open up downtown so visitors from that new highway can swing into the business district and find a parking spot. So again, with parking, everything old is new again. You know, of course, this will be better for downtown because right now you can't get a parking space. So it'll be better if everyone's going down 3rd Street, and people who actually want to shop downtown will be able to get a space. So here's a great little map from our collections at the museum that this shows you Bend in 1963. So to the right there, the little circle by the yellow line, so that's Pilot Butte State Park. And one thing to know is that there was pretty much no city past Pilot Butte. Once you got past Pilot Butte, it was farms and little else. And so the yellow line is Highway 20 running into town. And the purple line is how Highway 97 entered Bend in 1960, in the early 60s. And then the dotted line shows where the proposed bypass and what the bypass ended up being, where it would come down 3rd Street. So this gives you a nice clean picture of the old highway coming down what most of us know as Division Street and into downtown. You would turn and go up Franklin and connect at Franklin and 3rd where Walgreens is today. And then that continued the highway out of town. In 1962, where you see at the top where it says bypass, that is when it came down residential 3rd Street and connected up at Franklin again and kept going south towards Klamath Falls. So that was an enormous change. You go where the traffic is. I think that the departments of transportation are a not sexy, big changer of history that people don't often think about. Where you build the road is where you're going to put the businesses, unless your business is along a road that's moving. Obviously, that conversation comes up around famous things like Route 66 and all of that. But It comes to bear in every city and community with a highway. So this shot shows the bypass, and Vince Genna, the infamous Vince Genna, who is director of Bend Parks and Rec for years and years and years, designed these landscaped berms to be at the beginning of the bypass, so that you went one way to go still downtown and then the other way if you were just cutting through town. So this is where Division is today and comes into town. Although when the new freeway went in, Vince's landscaping was sacrificed to that. And there's an aerial shot of Vince's handiwork in plant life. And this is one of the residences that was lost when this move went through. So once you've moved Highway 97 to 3rd Street, everything along 3rd Street starts changing. Next time you drive down, if you look and notice, you'll still see lots of pockets of houses that were simply turned into commercial buildings. But this beautiful building was the Wiest family homestead. It was a magnificent 3-story volcanic tuft building that was torn down to put in a Chevron station. And that Chevron station today is the transmission shop, which is more readily located by its famous next door neighbor, the Purple Pretty Pussycat. And downtown did suffer, you know, making light of, oh, people will be able to come down and find a parking space and still be able to shop through the 60s, and it will be a recurring problem for the next 2 decades. Most of the businesses actually started moving themselves to 3rd Street and out of downtown. So gas stations, mechanics, all of that kind of business, and grocery stores especially, started leaving downtown and going to 3rd Street instead. And so the 60s in 1962 is the start of the decline of downtown, and it will stay in decline for a couple of decades. But downtown tried to respond, tried to modernize, tried to keep pace with the new decade. And the 60s and 70s were actually going to lose a lot of historic buildings. And a lot of people lament the Pilot Butte Inn, but this is a building that I wish was still here. This was First National Bank, and on the 2nd floor was where Dr. Coe, our famous frontier doctor, had his offices. And for a while, the Deschutes County offices were in here when we were first formed as a county in 1916. It was a beautiful brick building, but by 1962, it was not modern enough. So that theme of modernizing is hand in hand with Deschutes County needing to grow up during the 60s. And so this gorgeous building on the corner of Bond and Oregon came down in 62 and 63. It was replaced by the 1-story US Bank building that is there now. And the big feature that everybody was completely in love with that the new building would have was a drive-up teller. So in this headline of the bulletin, you can see not only the First National building as it was in its expanded form in 1962, but to the right-hand side of the photo, you'll also see the Cobble building. That building came down also and is the parking lot behind US Bank. So the sleepy little tourist town that everyone had come to know in the 40s and 50s is about to start changing. Things are afoot, and this little picture postcard of visiting Bend, Oregon isn't going to look the same for too much longer. One of the things to take note, if you can, in this postcard is this is still 2-way traffic on Wall Street. But that ends in 1967 is when we get the one-way traffic on Wall Street and Bond Street. Again, trying to modernize and improve downtown and make it a place that people wanted to go and shop. So watch your driving. But they reported only minor problems with going to the one-way grid system. I don't know, that parallel parking along the side, the street always looks so much wider than it does today. And I know that part of that is the trees that have been planted along the sides. So this is actually dipping into about 1971 or 72 for a second, but still representative of what's happening along 3rd Street. When the bypass went in, so in the center of this aerial photograph, which was taken by Bill Van Allen, you'll see some semi-trucks that are on 3rd Street, which was one of the pros. One of the things that people really wanted to get the highway off of Wall Street and downtown was to get that big truck traffic from having to go through downtown. The big building that you'll see in the bottom right is Wagner Market, which you'd know today as Albertsons and Wagner Mall. So what you're looking at in this photograph is 3rd Street cutting right through the middle, and Revere, where you have Wagner Mall and Safeway today. Wagner Market actually had existed for a long, long time on Greenwood. But again, opportunity and development, that when 3rd Street became Highway 97, what do you need along a highway when you've got people coming through? You need markets. And so the Wagner family seized the moment and picked up property on 3rd Street and moved their market there, and then eventually expanded it to Wagner Mall. Here's some newspaper headlines from their grand opening, when it's just a little stop sign there. The other gigantic thing that happened along 3rd Street that stuck in everyone's memory, and still to this day for a lot of longtime members of our historical society, is the December fire in 1963 that destroyed Allen Grade School. The fire department folks will talk about this at length, about the history that's been passed down to them through time, that the building was made from enormous wood timbers from the mill district that just made it very combustible, and the whole entire school was lost in no time at all. And fortunately, no deaths. They didn't try and go inside and fight it, thankfully. So this is a panoramic of Allen Grade School. So where Safeway is today on the corner of 3rd and Franklin, that was Allen School, and the property, behind was all its recess area and playground. It was named for Allen of the Brooks Scanlon Mill. Another couple shots of the building, and a couple shots of the fire in action. It was a complete and total loss. And one of the other things that we have in the collection from this event is from Marjorie Smith, who was a teacher at the school. And when sorting through the rubble and of her desk and her room, found a wad of coins that had been in her desk that are all melted together in one lump. And what replaced it? Well, now that 3rd Street was the major highway coming through town, it wasn't rebuilt as the school there. Instead, the school district focused on building Pilot Butte Elementary, and then a little bit later Juniper Elementary, back closer to the Butte, where we know them today, and the property sold to become commercial real estate. And what moved in? Safeway. And then really quickly, in less than a year, it becomes Bend Plaza Shopping Center, the first big indoor shopping mall in Deschutes County, right there at the corner of 3rd and Franklin. And a lot of very well-known, well-trafficked shops like Shearshaw's Ski Shop moved into the brand new plaza. So again, the decision to move the highway to 3rd Street completely changed that part of town forever. Up in Redmond, another devastating fire, this time at the Tight Knot lumber mill. The entire mill had been expanded and revamped in 1962, and unfortunately, in just about a couple of hours, the entire mill was wiped out in 1963. And that was a huge economic blow to Redmond for the rest of the good part of a whole year, that a couple hundred people were out of work while the mill was rebuilt. Potato was still king, though, in Redmond. And one of the fun things about the 60s, if you listen to our talk about the 50s, we knew that the potato business around Redmond had really started to grow by the end of the 1950s. And it grew to the point that the Redmond Potato Festival, which had started way back in 1919, but then had filtered out and given way to the Deschutes County Fair, potatoes had become such a big thing again that in 58 they brought the Potato Festival back. And so all through the 60s, from 1960 to 1970, Redmond celebrated with the Potato Festival again. And we have a couple cookbooks in the collection. So you get lines and lines of potatoes down the streets of Redmond for folks to come by and inspect. They were mostly russets, and they were referred to as netted gems, but Deschutes County farmers promoted them as Deschutes gems, that they were that would identify them specifically as being from the Great Central Oregon area. So you could cruise the potatoes and be impressed by the growing abilities of Redmond farmers. You could have potatoes. There would be the king and queen crowned, lots of celebratory events, but it only lasted through the 60s. By 1970, the Redmond Potato Festival was gone again, but I love that it came back for this decade. But what was the really big news? And of course, with the celebration of the landing on the moon, this has been a topic back in the public eye. In 1964, NASA identified Central Oregon as one of the places where astronauts would train to be ready for the moon trip. So, of course, President Kennedy, back to him, when the Soviets launched Sputnik and set off the great space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. We were, from 1961 to 1968, we were on a full court press to beat the Soviets to the moon. And part of that involved bringing astronauts here to Central Oregon to train. So everyone was on the lookout for the astronauts. What did this mean? What were they going to be doing? It was really fascinating. This space and the space race, all of those things did really capture the American imagination of how is this going to change the universe. I mean, it was beyond the planet. And so everyone was watching, everyone was excited that the astronauts were going to be coming to town and where they would actually be training at. Some sample headlines for you. So here's between 1964 and 1966, you can kind of see the pins on our map. The white ones don't do so well. But in August of 64, they practice at Mackenzie Pass lava flows, and they practice at Newberry Crater here, and then the pumice fields south of Crescent down here. And then in October, they're at Lava Butte. So these yellow-orangey tacks are where they trained in October, including down by Fort Rock, down in North Lake County, and around Newberry. And then in July of 66, the blue pins, again down by Fort Rock, at Newberry, at Lava Lands, and south of Tumalo are where the astronauts actually went through training exercises. And what did that mean that they went through training exercises? They tested their suits, they tested their equipment, they did field studies, they tried to just practice walking around in all of that equipment, some really kind of basic things there. And the big three were here, the three that go to the moon: Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong are all part of the group that comes and trains. But the urban legend fun part comes with astronaut James Irwin, who struck up a relationship with Floyd Watson of Bend. And yes, it's true. There is a piece of Central Oregon lava rock on the moon. This is on the left side of your screen is a letter from Jim to Floyd Watson in 1971, confirming that for his trip to the moon, he did carry a sliver of lava to the moon, and I left it there. I took a picture of that location and will send it to you as soon as it has been properly mounted. So thank you, Jim Irwin, for your promise to Floyd there. And it made the front page of the bulletin. Central Oregon rock rests on the moon. And there's the picture. It's kind of a little bit, hard to see. There's the little tiny arrow right there. There's the little rock next to a nice boot print on the moon, along with Jim's best wishes to Floyd. So that's an urban legend confirmed, and a story that we always love to tell people, and makes people excited to know that. OPB did a really great piece on this whole story. If you go to OPB's website, you can actually stream that program online. So I encourage you to check that out. Easy to find. Oregon's Moon Country, if you go to opb.org. Okay, for me, the 60s boils down to maybe our most famous resident from Central Oregon, and that would be the little man to the right, and that would be Thomas William Lawson McCall, who was born in 1913 in Massachusetts to actually a very, very, very wealthy family. Both of his grandfathers were wealthy, but Thomas Lawson, his mother's father, was a wealthy Boston stock promoter and railroad man. And when Dorothy married Tom's father, Henry, and became a McCall, his wedding present to them was a ranch along the Crooked River that they named Western World. And that became Tom McCall's home as a small child. And interestingly, his grandfather went bankrupt not long after they moved to this piece of property, but because he had gifted the ranch to Tom's parents, it didn't get involved in the bankruptcy. And so while the family fortune was largely lost at that point, they were still nestled in under the rim rock, as they like to refer to these years of his childhood out here in Central Oregon. And so that is where McCall grew up. And both of his grandfathers, were in politics back in Massachusetts. And so Tom McCall, who served in World War II in the Navy, went to University of Oregon and got a journalism degree. He actually came out of U of O and did go into journalism. He was a broadcaster. He was a reporter for the Oregonian. He had worked in both Idaho and in Oregon, and very famously, just before he became a politician, worked for KGW television in Portland. And the thing that really put him on the map was he did a documentary called Pollution in Paradise. And it was an hour-long piece that exposed the pollution of the Willamette River and what that meant in relationship to industry and business and livability and health in Oregon. So there's Tom McCall, who was a Republican, a conservative Republican, but also a very prominent environmentalist. And between he and some other key politicians in the state of Oregon at that time, he's why we have the Keep Oregon Green theme, which is kind of ironic coming from, what's considered the not green side of the state. But Tom McCall, more than just about any governor, has shaped Oregon and our way of life the most. There he is behind the governor's desk. He always had a very stern look, and he's the governor that's also famous for standing on television and telling people not to move here. But what he really meant was, if you look at the entire transcript, only move here if you mean it. To be an Oregonian, you had to want it. You it was a lifestyle and it was a commitment. It wasn't just a place you moved to for a job. If you moved to Oregon, you better mean it. And that meant living by, our standards of keeping Oregon this great place to live. So he gets a rap for that. But, keep Oregon green. It mattered, and it still matters today. Tom McCall kept Central Oregon really well connected. So this picture is Tom McCall and Vince Genna, again, our Vince, and Pat Nixon. So this, again, I'm skipping into the 70s just briefly. This is 1971, and Vince is receiving an award from Pat for the city of Bend for beautification and parks. That was a national award received by the district. Tom McCall, of course, gives us the beach bill, which made Oregon beaches open to the public and not privatized. He gives us the bottle bill, and he also ends up giving us our land use system, which comes under great scrutiny and great derision. But his main motivation behind the creation of Oregon's land use laws really did involve agriculture and protecting agriculture as cities began to expand and population growth. What did livability look like? That really mattered to Tom McCall and what it meant to the environment. And how did you merge industry and beautification and environmental quality and quality of life? How did you keep places like the beaches open for the public and not be sold off and locked away from everyone? And Tom McCall did not forget people around here. This is Dutch Stover, who was a very influential businessman. This is at the dedication of Stover Park. If you remember from the 1950s, one of the many things that Dutch did was start the Bend Water Pageant. This is Governor McCall and Lily Hollinshead at the dedication ceremony for Stover Park. Kessler Cannon, who was also in radio and journalism, same as Tom McCall. Kessler ends up leaving radio to go work for Tom McCall, specifically on environmental issues. And one of our other strong, important politicians from Central Oregon whose career parallels Tom McCall's. So you have Tom McCall in the governor's office from Deschutes County, starting in Central Oregon. The house is technically in Crook County, but he went to school in Redmond. I forgot that very important point, that Tom McCall is a graduate from Redmond school system. This is Sam Johnson and his wife, Becky. And so in Redmond, if you've ever seen Sam Johnson Park, this is Sam. Sam was a forestry graduate from California. His family owned lots of timber property up here around Central Oregon, including the Camp Sherman area and the Metolius area. And the Tight Knot Pine mill that burned in Redmond, he was a part owner of. But being a forestry major and a forestry background, Sam also saw environmental quality, livability issues creeping into the world in the 60s. And very similar to Tom McCall's standpoint of how do you merge and do both things? How do you have a good environmental quality of life and a functioning economic industry? And those things, they found, as Republicans, they found ways to work on them and merge, very different from a Republican Party that we see today with environmental issues. And Becky and Sam gave many, many, many gifts of time, effort, money to Deschutes County projects over the years. Selfishly so, the Historical Society was one of their benefactors. But perhaps one of the biggest gifts that they gave to Central Oregon was the headwaters of the Metolius. They actually owned that property as part of the family holdings. And in 1965, they donated the headwaters of the Metolius to the Forest Service. So if you've ever gone to that open spot and watched the Metolius River spring forth, you have Sam and Becky Johnson to thank for that, that it didn't remain in private holding. One of the other really amazing things that Sam took part in, again, in the late 60s. Around 66, he bought into the mill that was on the Warm Springs Reservation. But he did not hang on to that mill for very long. His goal was to transfer ownership of the mill to the tribes so that the tribes could be benefiting from the mill that was on their reservation. So right away when he purchased the mill, he entered into conversations with the tribes of what that exactly looked like, and created a path for ownership to be transferred completely to the tribes, which they did in a really relatively short period of time. By 1974, the tribes had bought Sam out, and the Warm Springs Mill became an asset, an employer for the reservation, owned by the reservation. And so that is among Sam Johnson's legacies in Central Oregon. What else mattered at that point in time? Well, lots of things, but Century Drive finally gets completely paved all the way around in 1967. So again, roads, it all comes back to roads, but also recreation. How can we get to the places that we want to be, the lakes and Mount Bachelor? So by 1967, we've grown up and have a paved Century Drive loop along its entire distance. And the 60s are enormous for Mount Bachelor. There's a tremendous amount of construction that happens. So we ended the 1950s, 1958, with the opening of Bachelor Butte. It's not even Mount Bachelor yet, it's Bachelor Butte. The Skyliners Ski Club and Bill Healy had gotten behind it and opened it, and they had 29,000 skiers that first season. Well, it's only going to grow. In 10 years' time, during the 60s, is when you start to see Bachelor Butte transform into what will be the Mount Bachelor that we know today. 1962, they get their first chairlift. When they had opened in the late 50s, they only had rope tows. So the first chairlift goes in 62, goes up 7,700 feet. It cost $100,000, which was the same amount that had cost to even start Mount Bachelor in the beginning. So we're almost doubling the number of skier visits every couple of years throughout the early part of the 60s. By 65, you get the red chair installed and a main lodge. 66, you get the yellow chair. But the really fun thing that comes in 1966, and I think all of the skiers listening will enjoy this story and wish that it was still there. The lodge that was built in 1966 was actually an overnight lodge. It had 8 rooms that slept 4 people per room. It rented for $12 a night if there were 2 people, $16 a night if you had 4 people. There were also 8 apartments that had kitchens in them that could sleep up to 8 people. Those rented for $25 a night. And one of the packages that you could get during the 5 years that the overnight lodge ran was for $110. 2 people could spend 3 nights, ski for 3 days, have 3 ski lessons. Their room would have a private bath, and they would get 3 breakfasts and 3 dinners, all for a whopping $110. I bet a whole lot of people would kill for an opportunity like that right now. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it was growing to the point that it was way beyond sustainable. And in 72, the overnight lodge was remodeled into just the main lodge. So there's a brochure from the early 1960s from the museum's collection. And there is the overnight lodge, 1966 to 1971. So as Bachelor's growing, we're starting to attract the attention of national competitions. So by the mid-60s, Bachelor could keep snow longer into the spring and early summer. So you actually start to see the U.S. Ski Association coming out and competing. And by the mid-60s, in 64 and 65, the Skyliners actually had successfully recruited getting junior national competitions to come to Bend. And one of the famous ones is in 1965. So there are ski junior national competitions at Bachelor Butte, slalom, grand slalom, things like that are happening up. It's multiple day competitions happening at Bachelor Butte. But the other piece that they still were competing in at that point in time was jumping. And the Skyliners and Bachelor mounted an effort to build a ski jump on Pilot Butte. This happened 1 year and 1 year only, and the end of the story is why it happened for 1 year only. So on the left there is a photograph from March of '65 with a diagram of the ski jump built off of Pilot Butte. At the top of the picture, it's a little hard to see. You have the road around Pilot Butte, and you'll see that white streak running all the way down is the snow that had to be trucked in from Bachelor and put on the butte because no snow came to build the jump with on its own. So they had to truck in snow. You can see with the bright white streak of where the jump is, there was no snow on either side, and the outrun area where skiers, run in to stop was entirely made of hay. So the skiers would come, do the jump, and drop down, and their outrun was to ditch in a big pile of hay. It kind of lives large in the memories of those people who saw it. This is the top of the newspaper for March 19th, 1965, showing one of the junior nationals in action, Mr. Scott Berry, poised, leaps, prepares for landing, runs to a hay-filled stop. So I can't show it to you today because we're on Zoom, but there is video of this that has been digitized and put on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and search Bend, Oregon, 1965 Junior Nationals ski jump, you will find half a dozen minutes worth of a great 1965 video showing all of the junior nationals jumping and ditching into the hay at the end. So one of the sad notes of the 60s that people didn't know at the time, that 1965's water pageant, the big festival that had dominated summertime in Bend, Oregon since 1933, that the 1965 water pageant ended up being the last one. The Chamber of Commerce didn't decide until after the event not to do the pageant anymore. So there was never really a finality to the end of the water pageant. It was just that they had the 1965 water pageant and then it was no more. And that's one of the big losses in the 60s as we're moving through time and feeling like things are changing, that the small logging town of 1960, by the time we get to 1970, is changed, and maybe not necessarily for the better for some. There's also hints at the end of the 1960s of where the economy in Deschutes County is headed. And so one of the biggest pieces is that in 1968, two gentlemen, if I can find my notes here, purchased the old site of Camp Abbott. John Gray and Donald McCallum, they purchased 5,484 acres that include the former site of Camp Abbott and local ranching lands, and they form Sun River Resort. And the only building from Camp Abbott that they keep is the Great Hall that everyone knows is there today. And it served as the offices for the Sun River Development Company. And by 1969, they have created their master plan and platted out the Sun River condominium and resort area. And this is our first hint at tourism resort centers that will bring in a whole different element of tourism, economic tourism, and travel and recreation as an economic driver for Deschutes County. We get Sun River in 1968. Inn at the Seventh Mountain also forms in 1968. and they're both selling condominiums by 1969. And hot on the heels of these two will be Black Butte Ranch come 1970. So an early brochure of the Sun River sales propaganda for those wanting to buy into Sun River. And on a personal note to the Historical Museum, in 1968, after trying for many, many, many years, the Deschutes Pioneers Association actually gets their first storefront museum on Greenwood. This is the old Tyler Blacksmith building. The building later becomes Deschutes County's Law Library, and it's still there today in front of the county courthouse. This is the nucleus of what will become the Deschutes Historical Museum later on in 1975. But for right now, it's the Deschutes Pioneers Museum on Greenwood that opened in 1968. So again, we're reflecting, we feel like we're becoming a modern town, and leaving our frontier Western roots behind us. And we're going to commemorate that in our first museum as we move forward into the bright, sparkling future with space and spacemen and astronauts and all of those things. So 1970, we've grown a little bit, 30,000 in the county, a 30% growth. But Bend is still, and Redmond and Sisters, everybody's still, spread out and pretty small. Bend is at 13,710 people, Redmond at 3,721, and Sisters, sadly, still shrinking. We're down to 516 people out in Sisters, which is largely a result of the lumber mills, some closing and lumber activity starting its slow decline until the lumber business here is no more. So that's what I've got for us for the 1960s. Hopefully I'll see you all back next month for the 1970s.
Kelly, I want to thank you for preparing these wonderful historical presentations. It really gives us a sense of who we were and who we are. And we look forward to seeing you next month when we can talk about the 70s. I can hardly wait, because that's when my family moved to Central Oregon. So I have a sense of what Central Oregon was like in the 70s. But
well, it'll be fun. We're moving more into time where people can start sharing memories with us and sharing stuff with us. Say, hey, did you know this happened?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks again for stopping by, and we'll see you next month.
Okay. Thanks.